Chapter 4 "Here's the river," Paxton announced, interrupting her memories. He'd kept them riding at a quick pace. He glanced back at her and suggested they rest for a while before continuing. After he dismounted, he went to Elizabeth and helped her down, although he was completely aware she needed no assistance. They walked their horses over to the river to let them drink, and went upstream a little to have a sip of the refreshing water themselves. Paxton looked up at the sky and the half-moon, and guessed it was nearing the middle of the night. They'd been riding for a while. "Do you think it would be too risky to have a swim, Pax?" Elizabeth asked. She was feeling very sweaty and dusty, an uncomfortable combination. "Well, it really depends if you think—" He paused and grinned mischievously. "Your fiancé will have missed you before Willie will have missed Velvet. Willie'll probably stay in that saloon until well after midnight, I reckon." "Stanton was finished with me for the evening. I doubt he'll notice my departure until morning." Paxton shrugged. "There was that guard I knocked out, too. I gave him a good bump on the head, but I doubt he'll be out for long. And then we don't know if he was expecting his replacement or company. We weren't really careful about our tracks. I decided speed was best, and then we could ride upriver to the mountains. It's not likely Stanton has anyone in his service that could tell whether we went up or down river, and I'll be sure to hide our tracks." Elizabeth nodded, beginning to remove her bodice. "Well, I don't think a 10-minute swim will make a huge difference. You can ride the horses upriver a bit, and I'll meet you there," she suggested, glad Willie had not taken her extra shirt, pants, chaps, and riding boots out of her saddlebag. "What? And leave you alone, naked?" He grinned. "Not a chance. Anyhow, there are more dangers to a woman in the woods at night than men and Indians." She looked half admonishing, half playful, as I am well aware, having lived in them for quite a while. She continued to remove the top layers of her clothing. "Now, Mr. Rain, please let a lady enjoy her bathing in peace and privacy." She lifted an eyebrow at him. "I can take care of myself, I assure you." "Seriously, Elizabeth, I'd rather you wait till we reach our destination. You can safely bathe in hot water at the cave, or at least in the lake you're familiar with. We'll be safe from our pursuers then." "Oh, Pax, just let me have a quick dip. I need to be refreshed now. Please? I don't have to go in too far. I'll just rinse." He shook his head. "You're stubborn as all get out, Lizzie." He sighed, concerned for her well-being, and partially aggravated he wasn't invited to join. "Just be careful, and don't take too long. I'll stay close so I can hear if you scream, and be back here pronto." "Okay." She stood in the last layer of her clothing, looking at him, and he could tell she was waiting for him to leave before taking it off. Frustrated, he grabbed both horses' reins, yanking their muzzles apart. "Well, if you should need me, Lizzie," her name dripped with venom, "just call." He mounted Castro with a gruff grunt, and the horse pawed the ground impatiently, alarmed at his master's sudden mood change. Petulantly, Paxton rode Castro upstream, with Velvet trailing lazily behind. He despised how much influence Elizabeth had over his emotions, how she'd make him angry in less than a moment, and how she'd make him overjoyed just as quickly. From the first moment he'd stepped into the cave and laid eyes on her, sleeping soundly in her comfortable bed, he knew she was the woman for him. From then on his heart and mind belonged to her. Although he could now look back and recognize that feeling for what it was, he was unable to discern his feelings then. A hint of a smile quirked the corners of his mouth. Winning her heart had been the greatest adventure he'd ever had, and that was saying something. He'd been in hot pursuit of Harrison Kent, a notorious cattle thief and murderer to boot, who was wanted in several counties and worth a fat commission if Paxton could bring him in alive. Unfortunately, this wanted man was not at all an ignorant brute. He'd been trained for survival in the wilderness. He was cunning and had not proved an easy capture. Paxton was determined, however, and had followed Kent when his fellow bounty hunters had given up in frustration and exhaustion. For nearly a month Paxton had pursued Kent, practically nipping at his heels, when he saw her. It was an unnaturally hot day, and the chase was causing Paxton some discomfort, and the excessive use of his water flask. It was not only his own discomfort, but Castro's as well, that had finally convinced him a rest was needed. He'd reached a summit which overlooked a particularly pretty valley. The sight made him marvel at the beauty of this as yet undeveloped country. He noticed a small lake with an attractive waterfall, and led Castro down to it. After bathing and refreshing Castro and himself, he decided to take a short nap. He let Castro wander to graze as he pleased, and found a lovely tree beside the lake which provided ample shade. Leaning up against it, he settled himself comfortably. He'd just covered his eyes with his cowboy hat when the sound of a woman's voice reached him. He sat up abruptly and glimpsed her, sitting on top of a regal midnight black mare. The girl was laughing, having obviously just returned from a pleasant ride. The breeze played with her glorious burgundy hair, and he noticed that her superb figure was scantily clad in an animal skin. The skin was wrapped tightly around her chest, covering her breasts and reaching down to about mid-thigh. He'd not seen that much skin — he wasn't thinking about the animal skin — on a woman for a long time, and he was rather taken back by the sight. She appeared to him like a glorious wild Amazon woman, those beautiful but dangerous women he'd read about in school. Those stories of the Amazon women and their battles with Heracles and the Greeks had always intrigued him. Evidently she'd not seen him, and had begun to remove her outfit, obviously intent on a swim. He'd used all of his willpower to avert his eyes. In that moment he forgot all about Harrison Kent. He'd found another conquest. He observed her for a couple of days, and marveled at her knowledge of the valley and of the ways of the wilderness. She, like Kent, had also been trained in the ways of the tracker, and Paxton wondered why and how she'd come to live like this. Not that he blamed her. Many of the women who lived in upscale towns and cities didn't have it as good as she did. Finally, after several days, he decided it was time to meet this woman and speak to her. Just before sunrise, he'd caught some fish and quietly entered her cave, carefully avoiding the traps she'd cleverly set about to alert her of any unexpected company. After stoking up the fire, he'd begun to cook the fish. He was happy to discover some wild tea leaves that she'd gathered and boiled some water, preparing himself a cup. The cave was extremely well kept and decorated. It was very comfortable, and he appreciated this young woman's clear talent for making any place a home. She stirred. He reckoned she must have been very tired to sleep through the smell of food cooking. At length she turned and opened her hazel eyes, which opened wide upon seeing him. He watched as her eyes moved about the cave, eyeing the fish on the fire, his cup of tea, and the rest of her domain. It looked as if she were assessing any immediate danger, which he also found admirable. "Good morning," he greeted. "I'm here to protect you, not harm you. I've been tracking a dangerous murderer, and I was afraid if I could find you, so could he." He gestured towards the tea. "Would you like some? It's delicious. You sure know your herbs." Her eyebrows furrowed, and she'd sat up. "You have some nerve," she'd begun, but hushed when he walked over to her with some tea. He literally towered over her, and she'd noticed this with some trepidation. "I know," he replied, smiling, "but I do hope the breakfast I've prepared for you will repair any offense I might have given." "Humph!" She sipped the tea and seemed pleasantly surprised. "Well, the tea certainly does." Her enjoyment vanished and was quickly replaced with reservation and suspicion, as if she felt guilty for having fraternized with a hazardous stranger. "Just what exactly are your intentions?" "It's like I said, ma'am. I'm here to protect you." "From whom?" "Harrison Kent, ma'am." He'd watched for any sign of recognition, but had found none. "Oh, really? Well, Mr. She waited for his name. "Paxton, ma'am. Paxton Rain." "Well, Mr. Rain, who will protect me from you?" He looked at her, startled. "I pose you no threat, ma'am." "I am a woman. You are a man. You pose a threat, whether you accept it or not." He scrutinized her, and suddenly realized what she was referring to, and chuckled softly. "I pose you no threat. Your virtue is safe around me. I'd never attempt to take something of yours without your permission." She blushed hotly, and he enjoyed her innocence and her embarrassment. Nevertheless, she swiftly rebuked him. "Well, you helped yourself to my tea, didn't you? And I'm quite positive I didn't give you permission for that." There was a stunned pause before he quickly changed the subject. "Breakfast?" He insisted on staying in the valley to protect her, and she, in turn, insisted he sleep elsewhere. She was not responsive to him at first, completely ignoring his presence. He gathered she did this in hopes that he'd leave, but he only found this a challenge, and he loved a challenge. After a week of leaving gifts at the cave opening, such as food, flowers, and little things he'd carved from wood, he was pleased to see that she was at least acknowledging him with a nod and a faint glimmer of a smile. One night he'd heard her cry out, and had rushed in to see if she was all right. She was obviously having a nightmare, and he reached out to wake her, but stopped dead when he'd felt something cold and hard against his stomach. Peering down slowly, he realized she held a knife. "You were having a nightmare, and cried out. I came in to see if you were all right. That's all." "Well, as you can see, I'm fine. Now please leave," she'd said, somewhat icily. He turned to leave, feeling disgruntled by her lack of trust in him. He was just thinking he should leave the valley and return to hunting hares in Kent, when she said softly, "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Rain."
"Call me Paxton, and you're welcome."
Elizabeth. Elizabeth Marie Dalton. Marie was my mother's name. She died when I was 4 years old. Paxton smiled at her, overjoyed to finally know this beautiful creature's name.
"It's a very pretty name,"
he replied softly, and left the cave. After that evening they'd started talking, walking, and hunting together. It was safe to say at that point that Elizabeth considered him a friend, one whom she trusted. Elizabeth watched until Paxton was out of sight, removed the rest of her clothing, and cautiously entered the water. Glancing upstream, she made sure Paxton was out of view before she immersed herself in the water. Enjoying the silky, cool caress of the river water, she waded upriver a little, and then swam across to the opposite bank. Reaching the other side of the river, she ducked her head and swam under the surface, testing whether she could make it back to the other side without a breath. When she felt the embankment in front of her, she popped her head up and gasped for air. Then she gasped again, but this gasp was from surprise, not a need for air. She was face to face with a large grizzly that was lazily pawing at the water. Upon seeing her, he rose to his full height and grunted. Elizabeth, slowly, so as not to spook the bear any further, paddled backwards towards the middle of the river. The bear watched her for a moment, but was obviously not interested in pursuing her. He grunted again, sniffed the air, then turned around and sauntered off. Elizabeth, thanking the Lord for sparing her any trouble with the bear, hastily swam back to shore. She heard someone chuckling and glanced over to where the sound came from. The sound was coming from a dark figure leaning against a tree with a large rifle resting against his shoulder.
"Well, that was a mighty close one. Thought you might have been a goner."
She smiled, although she was rather embarrassed at the situation. "With you around."
"You did tell me to leave."
"Yes, but I didn't expect you to listen for long. The bear was clearly uninterested in me, but I do believe it was your potent odor that saved me," she joked. "I'm sure you noted the way he sniffed the air before taking off so quickly."
"Huh?"
"Be a gentleman and turn around so I can change." He groaned, exasperated.
"Elizabeth, you are my wife. You're too much of a prude."
Affronted, she quipped, "I am not a prude, as you well know. I'm just modest, like a lady should be. Besides," her eyebrow rose impishly, "I don't want to cause you any trouble that might further delay us."
"Humph."
He paused, and then reluctantly conceded,
"I reckon you're right."
He turned his back to her, and she got out of the water, dried off, and dressed herself.
"Ready?"
He turned around, partially disappointed she was finished dressing.
"Let's go."
"Yes, sir."